Thank you for the invitation to address this scientific symposium today. My name is Shakuntala Tilston, and I'm the Global Lead of Nutrition and Public Health at WorldFish, a CGI entity. WorldFish is dedicated to the research, development, and innovations on aquatic foods for nourishing all peoples and our planet. With less than 9 harvests left before we reach the year 2030 and the agenda for sustainable development, we are now further away from realizing the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, SDG 2, to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Global hunger and malnutrition continue to rise, and the COVID-19 pandemic has reversed many of the achievements we have made lately. According to the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World Report for 2021, over 800 million people faced hunger in 2020, and 12% of the global population were severely insecure. The disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic, including the prolonged lockdowns, have affected the way we consume, supply, and produce food, and further expose us to the fragility and the inequity in our food systems. And this COVID-19 pandemic has further displaced the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized people from accessing sufficient, nutritious, diverse foods. The recently concluded UN Food Systems Summit 2021, the lead up to the Conference of Parties 26, as well as this Agrobiodiversity Congress, all give us a very clear message. We must transform our food, land, and water systems holistically in order to nourish all peoples and our planet. Underlying the tenets of transformation is diversity. Diversity of actors, diversity of foods consumed, the supply chains, and diversity of production systems. We are well aware that 75% of our global agriculture production come from the intensive cultivation of just 9 crop types, and we consume only about 121 species of plants. Similar patterns are reflected in the way we consume livestock and aquatic foods, with few aquatic foods, for example, tilapia, catfish, tuna, salmon, and shrimp, dominating the global consumption patterns. This narrow diversity of varieties and species have led to a number of disturbing issues, including mismanagement of resources, overfishing, destruction of natural habitats, and collapse of small and large industries. Unregulated and unreported fishing practices by some threaten our global aquatic food stocks and destroy important nurseries and breeding grounds, such as seagrass beds and coral reefs, and also mangroves. We can take action. We can embrace the concept of diversity to make an important paradigm shift towards food systems that are diverse, equitable, and sustainable, now and in the future. I have 3 key messages on which we can build this shift. My first message is to look beyond our present diets and increase the diversity of foods that we use in food preparations and in the foods we put in our plates. For example, within aquatic foods, this means we should consume much more than just tuna and salmon. We should consume a range of diverse aquatic foods, including pelagic small fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, and seaweed. Consumption of these low-trophic, high-biomass aquatic foods increases the intake of micronutrients, minerals and vitamins, and essential fatty acids, which are lacking in the diets of the poor and vulnerable. At the same time, they take away the pressure of capturing larger species or the need for intensive monoculture practices that prioritize large species of fish. An important pathway to increase consumption of diverse foods is through the inclusion of diverse aquatic foods, and not just fish, into national food-based dietary guidelines and in public procurement policies. Public programs such as safety nets, school feeding, and mother and child health care programs in partnership with the private sector can benefit from the inclusion of these nutritious superfoods. At the same time, these guidelines can inform consumers of the multiple benefits of diversifying their diets with aquatic foods. My next message is the need to analyze and understand the synergies and trade-offs between land and water systems, and develop integrated land-water management strategies that build diverse, resilient food production and supply chain systems. The diversification of pond polyculture systems across Asia and Africa proves successful in improving food and nutrition security at household level, as well as improving income and livelihoods, while providing opportunities for women and youth to find equitable roles in food systems. Integrated fish-rice systems and the establishment of community fish refuge, as for example in Cambodia, show that effective management of resources improves production and productivity, while at the same time conserving and providing biodiversity of indigenous fish and other aquatic foods. Lastly, I draw attention to the importance of bridging diverse traditional and indigenous knowledge with modern technologies for holistic food systems transformation. Indigenous and traditional food producers and consumers are experts in the environment, and they know the ecological resources which they depend on. Practice of staggering production cycles, crop rotation, recycling food waste, and the use of natural pest control within the system should be preserved and integrated in our modern food production systems. Present-day technologies can be used to build and disseminate traditional knowledge for diverse production systems while reducing the risk to our environment. It is therefore imperative that we include indigenous peoples, women and youth at all levels in our food systems transformation agenda, and they also reap the benefits of this transformation. Let us all embrace the commitment outlined in the 2021 Rome Declaration on using agrobiodiversity to transform food systems and incorporate these into solutions and actions for food systems transformation. And we must ensure that all people are guaranteed access to diverse, nutritious, safe, and sustainable foods up to 2030 and beyond. Thank you so much.
1 on value chains and environments. My name is Imge Jordan. I'm a home and nutrition economic scientist at the Alliance Biodiversity CIAT in Nairobi. I will moderate this session together with Gudrun, who you will see next to me. She's from the University of Göttingen. But before we start, just a few technical remarks about this session. To save time for dialoguing, we will keep the introduction very short, the introduction of the presenters and the panelists, and refer to the Woover app where you actually are participating and the Congress website for the respective bios of our very interesting speakers. And now, before we start with the presentations, also a kind reminder. Please use the Q&A section next to your screen to raise your questions. The presenters will try to respond to your specific questions directly in the app, and Gudrun and myself will try to include the more general questions into the panel round. Now let's start and enjoy the presentations of the 6 scientists. Over to you, Gudrun.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also a very warm welcome from my side. As Irmgard said, my name is Gudrun. I'm from the University of Göttingen, and I'm really honored and happy to be here today in this panel on value chains and food environments. So without much further ado, we will listen now to 3 presentations in one row, and then a short introduction and another 3 presentations. So as you know, fruits and vegetables are a major challenge in consumption all over the world. So I'm really happy that the first 2 presentations will focus on fruits in particular in the value chain and in the food environments. And then we have one more presentation on restaurants and what role they play in the food environment, also in value chains as a whole. So welcome to the first 3 presentations, and let's listen and watch together the videos. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Lorena Marchand from Santiago de Chile in South America. I am biochemist and founder of Botania. Thanks you to the committee for giving me the opportunity to present our work entitled Collaborative Conservation of Chilean Blood-Fledged Peach Varieties, used as a raw material for healthy and functional food development. The blood-fledged peach or vineyard peach is an older heritage cultivar with juicy red flesh and tart sweet flavor. They are popular in France, where more than 200 years ago, wine growers used to plant them on the vineyards as biological markers to detect the presence of powdery mildew. In Chile has a centenary presence in rural orchards and home gardens, where it's called Durazno betarraga. Reproduced by seeds, has passed through generations of family farmers and have been adapted to local environmental conditions. However, commercial cultivars with longer shelf life and cultural changes in food consumptions are threatening its conservation. We have been working for many years with the farm community in Maule region, who have conserved this heritage variety through the time. Our purpose is to develop a conservation program in collaboration with the farmer community and using food innovation. We have 3 objectives: to select those ecotypes with the highest anthocyanin levels based on polyphenols profiles and to propagate them by graft, to analyze antioxidant activity and total phenolic content and develop food ingredients using technology to retain those properties, to develop associativity capabilities in the community of farmers. Using high-performance liquid chromatography, we have determined the phenolic profile of a red-fledged peach population. Based on that results, 6 ecotypes were selected with the highest anthocyanin levels and propagated by graft. We have established 3 identical orchards of 200 individuals on farmers' lands. The antioxidant analysis showed that the Durazno betarraga has a high antioxidant capacity, similar to blueberry and higher than other peach varieties and other fruits like cherry, raspberry, and strawberry. We have developed a methodology to produce a high-pressure processed puree that keep the antioxidant capacity and color for 6 months at 4 Celsius degrees. This puree has received an excellent acceptance by chefs who have transformed it into ice cream, cocktails, and pastry. Additionally, we have developed associativity capabilities on the community, and now they are producing and selling jams and preserves under their own brand. To finish, and according to the scope of these sessions, I would like to present an overview of the stakeholders involved in the value chains of the Durazno betarraga. First, the farmers, who there are smallholders with a small production, but expected to increase the next couple of years. In addition to producing, they transform the peach into traditional products that are sold in local markets. There's also Botania, a venture that works closely with farmers, providing technical advice for peach management, developing innovation to obtain new food ingredients, and making outreach. In this innovation process, the knowledge provided by CEAP, a regional food processing research center, and other food and restaurant entrepreneurs has been fundamental in transforming the puree based on blood-fledged peach into delicious and healthy preparation for consumers. And finally, the consumers. Consumers are key actors of this network, and we need to work on consumer awareness to create a demand for local varieties and finally promote agrobiodiversity conservation. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gloria Luzzani, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Corporate Social Responsibility at the University of Zurich. Today, I'm going to present you our research about redefining the role of restaurants with the biodiversity of menu. I will share the presentation of our research so that you can also go through all of different steps. The authors of this research, it's myself and Isabel Schlueb, my colleague. The research questions are: how can restaurants contribute to increase knowledge about biodiversity of food? And what are the subjects that can be involved in knowledge creation about food biodiversity and its protection? And how can these subjects interact together with restaurants? The objectives of our research are designing a scalable and feasible framework that identifies a stakeholders platform for building knowledge on food biodiversity that can be source of information transferred by restaurants to consumers in order to raise awareness. Describing what is the role of restaurants in transferring this information and how they can contribute to knowledge construction and transfer about origin and biodiversity of food ingredients, type of processing, biodiversity of diets, local, seasonal, cultural, and traditional aspects of food. In this platform, we also wanted to identify all the actors involved. For instance, the new professionals that are more and more involved in contributing to increasing health of menus as nutritionists, and the emerging professionals that have more knowledge related to the sustainability of restaurants and the sustainability of diets. We also wanted to identify what are the relationships between the stakeholders and describing a new framework for the educational restaurant, as well as identifying the institutional settings of this platform. In this slide, you can see the outcomes. So we start from the knowledge and the information about the food item, its territory, its origin, and also, of course, the intrinsic information such as the species, the varieties of the food item, and all of this information are transferred, are aggregated, and can also form knowledge related to the tradition and also to the recipes, local and non-local, and the creation of new recipes that over time has happened. All of this information are processed by nutritionists, by sustainability experts, by university, local partners, and institutional partners that interact together with restaurants in order to create what we call the food fingerprint. So the information related to the biodiversity, the characteristics, the features of a specific food item that we want to transfer by means of experience that consumers have at the restaurant. So what are the tools that we identified? Menus, digital tools, but also workshops. And the new role of a restaurant in this case can be defined as educational restaurant, educational cuisine. We know that what is transferred by means of experience increase the knowledge. So the educational effort and the educational impact that experience has is higher than a simple transfer of theory and information. In this case, consumers can acquire new knowledge related to biodiversity of food, and this knowledge they can apply also at households level. We also identified a new externalities, positive externality that this platform and approach can have, such as a new form of tourism. What are the contributions that we are providing to this Congress? We propose a new approach to preserve environmental resources and to communicate the importance of biodiversity to consumers by envisaging a new platform that creates knowledge about food biodiversity by redefining the role of restaurants as an agent of knowledge transfer. To draw the conclusions about our research and proposals, restaurants can take an active part in preserving and building knowledge about food origins, species, and varieties, preserving cultural and traditional aspects of food and its sustainability. Restaurants can benefit from the platform by widening their meals offer, by including neglected and underutilized species in order to raise awareness. Restaurants can optimize the nutritional and sustainability quality of the offered meals by adapting their innovative recipes to the local guidelines for healthy diets, thanks to a better access to knowledge that the platform provides. So I will be happy to discuss with you how we can put into practice and how we can create together this platform. Thank you for your attention.
Welcome to the presentation Cornelian Cherry All Fruits, New Fashion. I am Ivana Cevoshki and I am researcher at the Mediterranean Agronomic Institute of Bari, Italy. Cornelian Cherry has been traditionally used as a food and medicine due to its unique flavor, nutritional properties, and health benefits. It was well-known plant in ancient time among Mediterranean population, but at present in some countries it's almost forgotten and underutilized. While in the Balkan Peninsula countries, fruits are traditionally used. The main purpose of our study is to demonstrate that by the valorization of Cornelian cherry, it's possible to bring tradition from the shores of ancient Greece to the contemporaneity. We pose different research questions. First of one is, are Cornelian cherry fruits suitable substrate for functional beverage development? If innovative technology can be used for their development, and how we can satisfy consumer preferences toward vegetarian and vegan foods products nowadays. The main objectives of our study to provide a comprehensive characterization of local genotypes, local introduced cultivars in Montenegro, to explore their potential use as innovative food products and ingredients, and to develop a novel food with potential probiotic effects. So our main outcomes is Cornelian cherry fruits are source of vitamin C, antioxidant, and iridoids that are natural antioxidant and colorant. Fruit per se can be a functional food or ingredient. It can be used to stabilize texture, flavor, and improve stability of food. Functional beverage that we develop is just an example of successful probiotication, and we believe that implementation of stepping up of novel emerging technology is very important for further valorization. So, what is our study? In our study, we characterized 11 Montenegrin Cornelian cherry local and introduced genotypes and cultivars collected in the wild or from organic orchard. So you can see in this photo how the samples are different in shape, size, color of fruits and stone. And among them we have 7 samples that were collected from organic wild collection and orchards. After the comprehensive characterization, overall we can conclude that local genotypes and local cultivars are better natural sources of bioactive compounds, and they have a high potential to be used in novel functional ingredients of even food, whereas introduced cultivars are more convenient for fresh consumption. At this figure, we can see fancy tales presentation of the main bioactive compounds found in Cornelian cherry, like vitamin C, antioxidant, iridoids, flavonoids, phenolic acid, and organic acid. And from the literature, we know that most of them, they have antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, anti-diabetic activity. And based on these results, we have selected the best candidates for next step for the technological valorization. What do we propose in this study? These studies provide a novel approach for development of organic non-dietary potential probiotic beverage. We use organic fruits to prepare the smoothies, which were first pasteurized with a novel process of technology, which is high pressure pasteurization, and then fermented by the potential probiotic yeast previously isolated from organic grown fruits. Once the potential probiotic yeast candidates were selected, the fermentation protocol was set up, and the fermentation smoothies undergo through the characterization in order to investigate the stability, yeast metabolized, and in vitro intestinal microbiota or effect on in vitro intestinal microbiota composition. By applying this novel approach, integrity and vital quality of Cornelian cherry during the processing and even shelf life were preserved. No significant changes in the content of main bioactive compounds such as vitamin C, iridoids, and anthocyanins were revealed. We produce a novel organic Cornelian Cherry smoothies that contain potential probiotic yeast blends that is natural, rich of a resource of vitamin C, and vegan, gluten-free, no egg and no GMO. This is just one presentation how we see the potential labeling of the novel products. And at the end, as this is just an example how other underutilized crop could be valorized. In this study, we debate so-called black box approach of simple addition of microencapsulated or dried microbiota cell during the development of non-direct probiotic food, and we propose alternative ways such as fermentation as more natural. And we believe that integration of Cornelian cherry fruits in organic and sustainable food system and value chain can contribute to better nutrition, food security, dietary diversification, and agrobiodiversification. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to meet you during the conference. Thank you again.
Yeah, now we have listened nice 3 presentations, and we continue with inspiring information about foods from the Ant Mountains. Alejandra will show us an example on how we may promote our local foods. Traveling from Lima to Nepal, we will be informed about value chain development of traditional crops in Nepal by Devendra. And finally, Sayed will look into the knowledge base of forgotten foods, which may feed the future. Let's continue to listen, and don't forget the Q&A session. See you soon.
Hello, this is Devendra Ghosh, and I'm an agricultural economist affiliated to Alliance of Biodiversity International and SEAD based in Kathmandu, Nepal. My topic for today's presentation is value chain development of traditional crop for nature positive and nutrition sensitive food system development in Nepal. In these presentations, I would like to focus on importance of traditional underutilized crop that are cultivated by smallholder farmers in the Himalayan mountains of Nepal, which is very important for food security of the vulnerable smaller farmers. By using a framework for biodiversity based and nutrition sensitive value chain, using different combination of tools and approaches. These crops, which are grown in the high mountains of Himalayan region of Nepal, includes amaranth, barley, buckwheat, beans, and different sorts of minor millets like foxtail millet, porso millet, and finger millet, including a high altitude cold tolerant rice. And these crops are often called Himalayan superfood in Nepal because of their very high nutrient dense traits. Locally, they are very much locally adapted, climate resilient, and economically viable under harsh mountain environments. The research question in this study, I would like to focus there are 3 important research questions, which includes, the first one is what is the current status and constraint in the value chain of traditional crop in Nepal Himalayas, and the second is how to improve demand and supply of nutrient dense and healthy foods from traditional crop. The third one is what initiatives are being employed to promote nature positive and nutrition sensitive value chain development. Of course, the objectives are very much interlinked with the research questions, with specific focus on analysis and assessment of value chain and mapping of different subcomponents of value chains and identifying constraints and drivers and opportunities in each of the subcomponents so that we could suggest strategy and mechanism for improving and upgrading the value chain of traditional crops. The outcome 1 is the framework we developed for mapping of value chain crops employing biodiversity and nutrition sensitive value chain in terms of 5 subcomponents, which include seed system, production, processing, promotion, and consumptions. And based on analysis, found that value chain of these crops are very much underdeveloped, poorly connected between different subcomponents, and very much limited participation of research and development actors and private sectors. And they were very much disincentivized by the policy framework at the national level, so they were very much underutilized and often called as orphan crops. The second outcome is the framework we developed for value chain upgrading strategy of crops in terms of 5 subcomponents: seed system, production, processing, promotion, and consumptions. The strategy for seed system improvement was to promote the seed diversity and quality by establishing and strengthening community seed banks, sourcing, deploying of diversity of the genetic resources to improve seed systems, and through participatory crop improvement with the involvement of farmers and communities. The production system was improved through variety adaptation, diversification, crop soil water management, and organic pest management using agroecological principles. And the processing and value addition components was upgraded with the design of simplified version of the electric thresher for minor millets, and also the food recipe formulations, and also nutrition analysis to promote them. And the promotion system were mainly improved and focused through both market and non-market methods by linking with niche market through branding, packaging, and labeling, as well as organizations of biodiversity fair and organic food fair to sensitize the value of these traditional underutilized crops in terms of their health and nutrition. And also the consumption system was improved through access to diversified diets of these traditional nutrient crops. The research contribution to the Congress includes mainly in the three ways. The first is it generates insights for improving value chains through two distinct pathways of demand and supply side interventions. And the second is to it provides the framework for biodiversity-based value chain combining with nutrition-sensitive holistic value chain by exploiting the traditional nutrient crop. And the third is it provides insights to for using local agrobiodiversity for revitalizing indigenous agrobiodiversity for traditional food system development and developing new markets for developing nature positive and nutrition sensitive food system development. Thank you very much for kind attention and listening. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alejandra Arza, and I'm joining this roundtable on value chains in food environments from Lima, Peru. I am Associate Scientist in Agrobiodiversity at the International Potato Center's Andean Initiative. And I'm very glad and grateful for the opportunity to present at the second Agrobiodiversity Congress. This presentation showcases a publication of two books, 50 Andean Future Foods and 50 Recipes for Culinary Innovation. This will be officially launched this December 9th to commemorate the International Potato Center's 50th anniversary. The central question that motivated the realization of these two books, which required the collaboration of more than 100 scientists and chefs, is how can we promote the use and consumption of the Andes' unique nutrient-rich agrobiodiversity to contribute to healthy diets, social inclusion, and sustainable food systems. While its purpose is to celebrate 50 native Andean domesticated and wild foods, the people who grow and harvest them, and those who transform them through ancestral culinary tradition or Nova-Andean culinary innovation. Through vivid professional photography and up-to-date scientific content on each Andean food, we highlight the potential and challenges to diversify our food systems with native agrobiodiversity. The books also illustrate how we can build on the Andean legacy and move forward 50 years to the point when our food systems are socially inclusive, nutritious and healthy, and environmentally sustainable. To commemorate SIP's 50th anniversary and the biocultural diversity of our homeland, the Andes, we have systematized detailed information on 50 native cultivated and wild food species and their ancestral food processing techniques. We have also compiled 50 recipes from traditional cuisine and chefs from Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, using these native ingredients and drawing from iconic traditional and Novo-Andean cuisine. We aspire for the results of this incredible collaboration to go beyond the actual physical publications and promote further by discovery of underutilized Andean foods to inform stakeholders from consumers to diverse market actors as to the state of knowledge and nutraceutical value of this Andean agrobiodiversity, to stimulate investment in socially inclusive bioeconomies and short farm-to-fork value chains in the Andes, and to trigger healthy diets using biodiverse foods and conducive environments in the Andean region. Finally, how do these publications contribute to the Congress, and specifically to this roundtable session with consumption as theme? They showcase the potential role of these Andean future foods in shaping healthy food systems and contributing to human nutrition, while inspiring others through this diverse collaboration of family farmers, cooks, chefs, professional photographers, and more than 50 scientists from the Andean region with a shared passion and devotion to agrobiodiversity. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hello, I'm Syed Azam Ali. I'm the CEO of Crops for the Future, and my colleague Ibrahim Jahanshiri is the co-author on this presentation. The title of the presentation is How Can Forgotten Foods Feed the Future? And in our presentation, we'll focus on Crop Base, a global knowledge base for forgotten crops developed by Crops for the Future. The essential question we're addressing is to ask why, out of 7,000 crops grown by humanity, only 4, wheat, rice, maize, and soy, now provide over 60% of the calories in the human diet. And at the same time, out of 7,000 living languages, only 4 languages, English, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and Hindi Urdu, are now spoken by over half of the world's population. Essentially, this means that we have a globalized food system in which 4 crops, often grown as industrial monocultures, and 4 languages are responsible for the knowledge on those crops, from their conservation and genetic resources to their production, harvesting, processing, transport, trade, marketing, and consumption. Now, we have to ask the question whether those 4 crops and a single globalized food system and knowledge stored in 4 languages will be adequate, not just for 7.8 billion people to be fed, but for 10 billion people to be nourished. Not in our current temperatures, but at temperatures at 3 degrees above pre-industrial revolution levels. If those 4 crops and 4 languages won't be enough, we need to transform food systems. And to do that, we need to diversify agriculture from beyond 4 crops and 4 languages to include those crops that are climate resilient, nutritious, productive, and able to sustain humanity and provide nutrition in climates that are increasingly too hostile for mainstream crops. Now, to do that, we need to start with a knowledge base so that we can make decisions based on evidence as to which crops are most suitable, what their end uses are, and how they can actually benefit humanity without causing great destruction to the planetary ecosystem. That was the objective that we set in establishing Crops for the Future's crop-based knowledge platform. And in it, we recognized the lack of coordinated information, publicly available data on underutilized crops. So we set about to establish a curation system in which knowledge could be stored in databases to make that knowledge available through computer applications and digital formats to end users in an accessible and usable form, and to be based on scientific data on agroecology, germplasm information, nutrition, socioeconomics, and post-harvest information, linked with local data on indigenous knowledge, recipes, markets, products, perceptions, and environmental data for soil, land use, geospatial conditions under current and future climate scenarios. This was the challenge that we set, because at the time we had not identified any global knowledge system that was dedicated to the world's 7,000 underutilized crops. Now, the global knowledge base, crop base, has now become a significant platform for knowledge on underutilized crops. In fact, we have about 2,700 crops in the knowledge base. We developed farmer apps. We've looked at data entries and surveys. We've accessed publicly available international databases and government and local data, and we've crowdsourced. Together, we have put big data into a format that can be linked through data linkage, a centralized data linkage system, to allow us both to process data and to machine learn from that data. This has led to a number of applications. Those applications include an app called Select Crop, in which we look at the selection and suitability of crops for different conditions, not just for their yield, not just for their potential to be grown in different locations, but for factors such as their climate resilience, their nutritional value, and their return on investment, so that we can rank crops for the end use purpose that is required under different circumstances. Increasingly, we have included information not just on the yield of the crops, but through an app called Assess Crop to look at their nutritional composition. And nutritional composition includes macronutrient, micronutrient, functionality, and the compositional analysis of different foods made from ingredients, including underutilized crops. Now, for this, we have developed CropBase now as a farm to fork, a genomics to products tool for underutilized crops along the value chain. And for this, we've included digital data from those sources that are available, publicly available, our own data from experimental information and research, and semi-structured sources of data, including vernacular and indigenous knowledge, in a form that is transparent and to be interoperable between different formats. CropBase is now available and accessible, and at this stage, we are looking for partners and we're looking for funding to support data infrastructure and software and increased applications. So who is the CropBase knowledge system actually usable for and accessible to? First of all, policy and regulation, in which stakeholders such as agri-food organizations, policy decision makers, sponsors, and regulatory agencies can access information on underutilized crops as a comparison with that on mainstream systems and crops. We're looking at environments such for sustainability, land potential, impact assessment, and sustainable development goals, in which we can actually demonstrate the suitability of underutilized crops against existing agricultural systems for decisions to be made, not just now, but over long-term goals and in relation to the sustainable development objectives. We have been a significant partner in two major projects, one that's coming to the end of its funding, the EU Land Support Project, which is developing decision-making tools on land use options, for which we have included underutilized crops, a European-wide information system and decision-making tool, and the new project, EU Radiant, which specifically looks at underutilized crops, for which we can actually identify end users, products, and potential beneficiaries. CropBase is also accessible for private sector and operational purposes to stakeholders across the whole of the private sector and industry, farmers, plantations, and local governments. Focus areas are optimization of rural and urban land use, logistics for value chain transparency, and food system investments. And for that, we've developed our two applications, Select Crop, in which decisions can be made on a ranking of crops for different locations for different purposes, and Assess Crop to identify nutritional value over and above the calorific content in economic yield of particular crops. And at the community scale, we've identified stakeholders, both at the landscape level and the scientific community, and to link multi-stakeholder data collection, both through crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, and participatory research. For this, we've looked at focus areas for community projects, knowledge sharing, capacity development, and networks that we can actually see the potential and expansion of underutilized crops into value chains and mainstream systems. And most recently, we see crop-based as a valuable tool that can be used in the newly launched Manifesto on Forgotten Foods, which calls for a global plan of action for forgotten foods, in which again, an evidence-based and knowledge system will be critical. And for the Global Action Plan for Agricultural Diversification, which was launched alongside the Paris Climate Meeting in 2015 by the Association of International Research and Development Centers for Agriculture and Innovation, AIRCA, and other partners. Thank you.
First roundtable on value chains and food environment. We are very much looking forward to all your questions. Unfortunately, as you might have noticed, those who have just presented, they cannot be here live with us. However, they can answer your questions either in the chat or please get connected with them directly on the Google platform. Also, I would like to encourage you to look up the bios of our 4 panelists that we are very honored to have here with us today, because they have very long stories, I think so, but we will introduce each one of them one by one when we start with our first question now. So first of all, we would like to know, how do you reflect now on these presentations that we have just heard on? What is the key message that you take away? What is your take-home message from this presentation, even for your own work? And we would like to start with a scientist perspective. So I would like to call upon Dr. Selena Ahmed. She's an associate professor of sustainable food systems. So I think this matches very well. Selena, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank all of the abstract presenters for their inspiring work. Lots to reflect on and lots to think about going forward for promoting agrobiodiversity and overall sustainability in the food system. So the first take-home point that I had and thinking about application to sustainable food systems work is how the numerous factors, environmental factors, management factors, the way we manage agro ecosystems, the choice of cultivars, and the way we process foods ultimately impacts multiple food attributes, as the panelists showed, as the speakers showed, in terms of their biochemical composition, the various phytochemicals, as well as the sensory attributes, and how these attributes are so important for the way that consumers value agrobiodiversity. And so I thought it was really stellar how multiple of the presenters focused on research on the biochemical composition of food, as well as the sensory attributes of food, and really highlighting the linkage of that when we want to start to make linkages in the food system of agro ecosystems to the rest of the food system, how that connection to consumers through biochemical composition and through sensory attributes or organoleptic attributes is so important. And so I think the presenters collectively presented this framework where we can really begin to see biochemical composition and sensory attributes as this linkage between the production and consumption side of food systems, and really intersecting at the food environment. The second take-home point for me was the importance of cultural heritage and underutilized species for promoting and valuing agrobiodiversity, as well as dietary diversity and dietary quality. And sort of thinking in the future, what does this mean? How can we better have data that's aligned for these various parts of the food system? The third major take-home point for me was, if we want to conserve agrobiodiversity, and again, this goes back to that first framework point, that we really need to think across the value chain and include food environments. The presentation of restaurants was a really wonderful example of engagement with food environments, restaurants being a type of food environments being where consumers interface with the food system. And so it being really, really critical to look at the food system as a place for education for consumers. I think that's really, really critical. And if we want to shape supply and demand, the food environment is a really critical place to do so. And I think going forward, the food environment can really be a place to educate consumers on sustainability attributes of food. Sustainability attributes of food are very difficult to trace in the food system. And I think the role of food environments can very much be to transform into these places of education, as our speaker showed. And then finally, I think the presenters did a really nice job highlighting the importance of taking a holistic approach, a systems perspective, and really celebrating the diversity of stakeholders across the food system for meeting these objectives of promoting agrobiodiversity and supporting dietary quality. And so those are the key take-homes I had from these wonderful, inspiring talks.
Great, thank you so much for these 4 main points. I saw at least one question already regarding the restaurants, but I think we first move on to give you a chance to talk once and then we take on messages. So I would like to call on Jessica Bogart now as a advanced and accredited practicing dietitian and public health nutritionist from Brisbane. Would you like to share your take-home and key messages with us?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I'd like to, if I may, just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which I join this meeting today, which are the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And a very big thank you to the wonderful speakers. It was a fascinating collection of talks. I really enjoyed listening to all of them, and I guess reflecting on what we've heard, a common theme that's coming through is that these are all really just nice examples, different examples in different contexts of ways that nutritious and underutilized foods can really make much greater contributions to healthy and sustainable diets around the world. We had the novel food products, the examples around sort of education and promotion through the restaurants, as well as through the beautiful book that was presented, all kinds of community engagement activities that was talked about in the Nepal example. And of course the amazing crop database that we heard about just last there, which was really fascinating to learn about. It's so great to see these examples where nutritional properties are being prioritized in planning production systems, and particularly around the breeding work. Often the nutritional profiles is not something that's sort of necessarily prioritized in those approaches, and so it's great to see those examples in the fruits, for example. I live in Australia, and here it's quite common to see in restaurants the kilocalories mentioned on the menu. And I love that example from talking about restaurants as a place for education around biodiversity. I'd much rather see some information on local cultivars or traditional recipes and sustainability aspects in my local restaurants. That could be really fascinating. It struck me when I was listening to that a next step could be if you could scale that approach by getting it adopted through public procurement policies, for example, that's when you could, sort of take that to a next level and reach a really, even greater audience. And I guess sort of a broad sort of key message that I take away from these talks is that when we're sort of addressing a nutritional challenge in any given context, you know, it's so important to look for those local examples. You know, there's, you know, sometimes I think we look for silver bullets that have been applied all over the place, and sometimes the solutions to particular issues can, you know, are right under our noses. And so it's so great to kind of hear all of this work that's around discovering these local foods and their benefits, and promoting biodiversity as a tool for improving nutrition, and really, you know, celebrating that diversity, as well as, you know, promoting the cultural values, the traditions that's related to food, because I think that's such an important aspect of human relationships with food. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is really an important point that we focus on these local examples, really, and give them a room, what we just did here. So thank you so much for that. So I'd like to move on, and I would like to ask Florence Tartanac. She's with the FAO. She's a senior officer in the Food and Nutrition Division at FAO, and she's also the team leader of the Market Linkages and Value Chains team. So we are very much looking forward to your perspective and to your reflection on the presentations and your key or take-home message. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for this very interesting panel. So I will somehow repeat a little what my two colleagues said, but I also enjoy very much the presentations, and I found them very diverse also in the way they are addressing the issue. And what I will say will go in the same direction than Jessica, but the key message for me is the importance of healthy diet and how agrobiodiversity can improve nutrition. And this was really clear in all the presentation. As you know, if we take a more global perspective, according to the 2021 State of Food Insecurity World Report, we still have up to 811 million people in 2020 who live in hunger. And healthy diet is out of reach of around 3 billion people. So we really have a big problem here. And we know that agriculture and food systems have key roles to play for improving nutrition by making healthy diet possible, affordable, desirable, and sustainable. But still, we are not there, and there is a lot of effort to do in that direction. A healthy diet should include a highly diverse range of food, and this means the source of food should also be highly diverse. And we know that the modern agriculture has made outstanding achievement in production, but relies on relatively few species, as the last presenter showed now in his presentation about the reduction and the pyramidal reduction of species due to the modern food system that we have actually. So therefore, it's very important to protect agrobiodiversity. It is crucial for ensuring this sustained supply of diverse foods. And also papers actually presented highlighted the contribution of this specific product from agrobiodiversity to healthy diet. And this involves many aspects, like preserving the original environment that the species inhabit, supporting the farmers and breeders who are often indigenous people, such as in the case presented by the SIP in the Andean region with the Andean and traditional crops. And also the other papers showed how research can improve access to market for this product by, for example, innovative food processing, for example, the case of cherry in Montenegro, the blood flesh peach in Chile, but also looking at raising awareness in general public, and for example, with the case of chefs and restaurants. So it's also important to look, and the other colleagues also mentioned it, that the kind of intervention should be all along the value chain, and looking at the nutrition value along the value chain also to improve nutrition should be an important consideration for developing a value chain. And for example, this was very clear in the presentation from Nepal, where they were describing a project where they were looking at all the steps on the value chain. Thank you very much. I will leave it for now.
Thank you so much. Covering the whole value chain, I guess this is often an issue for several projects. So yes, thank you. Now we move on to Federico Mattei. I'm also looking forward to hear your take. He is a project development and international relations officer with Slow Food. So we now get the perspective of, this movement and maybe more of the adopter side. So please share with us your reflection on the
Thank you, Gudrun, and it is a pleasure being here. I thought all the presentations were excellent, all the abstracts were excellent. I would like to touch upon something which has been touched upon before, which is the role of the chefs, because they were present in two of the presentations, which I think is very interesting because it shows a shift in how we promote food systems. And I think chefs are a very great example of a kind of stakeholder that can promote food systems, sustainable food systems. Because farmers, producers often are very good at doing what they do, which is producing good, clean, fair food. They can sometimes be less good at transmitting the value of these foods to the consumers, especially because chefs are very good at this. First of all, because they have become minor celebrities in the last few years, but also because they have that direct interaction with people. And it is very important, not only that they transmit the value of biodiverse food, of seasonality, of 0 kilometers, of these kind of aspects, but also really transmit the general understanding that food systems derive from a mixture of ecosystems, communities, and culture. And it is the expression of all three of these which creates food systems, foods, and recipes, and so on. I would also like to touch upon, I think Dr. Luzzani in the first presentation briefly mentioned tourism. And I think this can also be something which can be very useful for the future. And when we think of tourism, we don't necessarily have to think of, long haul traveling from one side of the world to the other, which probably wasn't very sustainable before COVID and is even less so now. But tourism and traveling as urban populations moving to the rural areas around their cities, in their countries, in neighboring countries, passing the day and experiencing the realities of food producers, whether these are farmers, fisher folk, or intermediary value chain actors. And this has the double effect, not only of providing a direct income for these stakeholders, but really in shifting the consumption patterns of those consumers when they go back to urban centers. And it is through the shift in consumption patterns that we can contribute to a change in the production paradigm, let's say. So I thought it was very interesting how these, let's say, novel techniques and novel stakeholders are being focused on ever more as we go along. But I thought all the presentations are excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Gudrun, may I? No, there are two questions from the audience, I think, which are very important. And one is, I think, related to actually where are our resources in terms of seeds? How can we access them to ensure that we don't lose them in the value chain and the food environment we are observing? And the other one, a very important question, is also looking into how can we communicate better about that? Federico, you mentioned a little bit also like we just travel and be aware about our culture. But at the same time, how can we make, that would be my question on board of that, how can we relate this to that the rural population is also becoming proud on what they have locally and which are very identical for their environment? And that's back to you, Gudrun. You have to now select the speakers on that.
Well, okay, maybe you can also just unmute and who wants to start. You put two questions. I just wanted to encourage, first of all, everybody out there to put your questions because we have still 25 minutes left. So please make use of this great panel here to shoot your questions now. Okay, we start with the first two on the seed systems. I don't know, who wants to say something on this? It's open. Yes, Federico.
I will say something. I think seeds are seeds are one of the most important aspects of food systems, and the change in how seeds are, let's say, bought, the whole intellectual property behind seeds can be very problematic sometimes. Let us remember that much of biodiversity, or at least the agricultural biodiversity, has been generated by generations of farmers, by generations of producers, in experimenting, in trading seeds, in bringing them to the fair and giving them around. This interaction between people and seeds is very important. And we have seen a trend in the last decades of placing intellectual property on seeds, which can be very important because it can, let's say, promote innovation, it can promote research funds and so forth, but it must not limit the possibility of farmers, especially smallholder farmers throughout the world, in preserving these seeds and trading these seeds, and ultimately in experimenting with these seeds and trying to adapt them to local climatic conditions.
Selena, I saw you nodding when it came to specific food ingredients Federico was mentioning. What is your situation in Montana, looking into what do you know actually about your food environment there in terms of food composition? Because this is also another question which is coming in when it comes to seed availability and the acknowledgement about the value of these specific crops.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm hearing two questions in your question, but in terms of, I was nodding because absolutely seeds are the seed of the food system and really, really critical to acknowledge and to conserve and to really foster all of that experimentation that farmers have engaged in for centuries and more. And so in terms of food environments, and I think one thing that's really critical when we're thinking about food environments is just acknowledging the different types of food environments. A lot of times we're thinking about the built food environment, so the retail food environment, institutional food environment, but also wild and cultivated food environments can be seen in that same framework. And I think by looking at food environments that way, we can then begin to really see linkages between cultivated and wild food environments where seeds are embedded to the retail and built food environment. So that's one thing. And then thinking about, the biochemical composition. So, the seed and the species and a specific cultivar is intrinsically has a certain biochemical composition level. And based on farmers' decision-making, and based on all decisions along the value chain, that biochemical composition and that ultimately impacts the flavor profile varies so tremendously. And so it's really nice to and kind of inspiring to think about like the journey of a seed into a crop and then how that biochemical composition is transformed in such diverse ways across the food system. Lawrence.
Yeah, may I add something? My colleagues highlighted the importance of seeds, and I cannot agree more with this. Seeds are very important, and they are very important to preserve it. But it cannot be done in isolation from all the other activities that we have to do. And you also talked about it, to highlight with the chefs, the food environment, etc. And I just would like to give the example of a project that we recently implemented with Biodiversity International, which is called Biodiversity for Food and Nutrition Project, that was implemented in 4 countries, in Brazil, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Turkey. And where we put together a whole range of activities and approaches with more than 14 universities, research institutes, ministries, civil society organization, etc., to really partners and show first provide the evidence. We talked about food composition. It's very important to know what is the food composition of this food, which is not there actually, and to influence the policy and to raise awareness about the importance of biodiversity So, for example, for this project, we in the 4 countries, we generated data on food composition for more than 200 underutilized species with nutrition potential, and now it is available also in the global FAO in food composition database for biodiversity for researchers. And we also updated the national food composition tables in several countries. And just to highlight also the importance for Africa, this kind of intervention is very, very important in all parts of the world. But in Africa, we really see that, and this was a specific case of Kenya, when in one county, the Busia county, the project was able to prioritize indigenous crops such as iron-rich African leaf vegetables, and also drought-resistant Bambara groundnut that are typically found only in smallholder farms and household gardens. So in a region where there is high malnutrition, these are very important source of micronutrients. And with this project, we were able to highlight policies on biodiversity conservation in the counties, and also farmer business schools to train farmers how to use or to improve their production technique. And even with introduction of this food in a school feeding program in the county. So this is the kind of thing that we can do. Also, awareness raising events are very important, also to show the farmers how important are what they are producing. And recipe books also we did this. So it's all range of things should be together. It's my message here.
Thank you, Florence. And before I hand over to Gudrun to also do a final round among the panelists, I have an important question to you, Jessica. It's going along about the policy implications we face. Aaron asked, for example, do the panelists think that that there's a tension and pulling in different directions, or are there complementary approaches and pulling in the same direction? Can we have another examples as well where we actually can look into local policies, but also scale it up and at the same time keep the local policies while their general national policy level may be actually controversial in that part of movement? Do you have any ideas where we can work on that?
Thanks. It's a very complex and interesting question. I recognize the tension that the questionnaire is sort of posing there, and I agree that there can be a tension between some of these sort of approaches, for example, around novel products, and then more widespread adoption for promoting agrobiodiverse food systems. It doesn't have to be a tension. I think it's all about in how we approach things, and I think there's in research there's a lot more thinking around understanding from a systems perspective the role that different how our food systems operate, and I think really being mindful about sort of unintended consequences, or making sure that we think through implications. If we intervene in a food system in a certain place, how might that flow through the value chain? Which stakeholders will it affect? What are the potential outcomes? I think it's in sort of linking that to policy more broadly, one of the things I think is so important is recognizing that we have multiple objectives for our food systems. I come from a human health nutrition perspective, and that's often my sort of number one priority. But our food systems are intended to do so many things. They're the basis of livelihoods. We need them to be, environmentally sustainable. There's economic aspects, cultural and social aspects, all kinds of objectives of our food systems. And so I think we sort of need to think of that as a broad sort of framework for a food system, and that when we're thinking about intervening in the food system, how might it sort of influence all of those outcomes that we're interested in, and just sort of think through potential trade-offs, and where there are opportunities to kind of maximize the synergies among those sort of those different objectives.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. This already gave some future outlook, I would say. But Irmgard, any other questions? Or, I mean, probably there are.
No, I think a part of this is also how do we actually preserve diversity? I think we slightly touched this a little bit, but I may add into the closing round maybe the question on food safety. In terms of local food systems and the monitoring and surveillance of this in the food environment systems we have actually at the global level, where their regulations come in, and how do these harm actually biodiversity, diverse diets and health? Maybe you can reflect on this while we have the closing round before I summarize what I think was the key messages I took home. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let's have one more round then, and we were asked to ask you, well, just that you maybe now look ahead. Okay, we heard of some projects that are ongoing, but as we all know, projects always raise new questions and we see new research gaps. So what would you also give now back to all those listening out there? What would be major research gaps now, is specifically on value chains and food environments? What would be next steps, future work along the line of the value chains and for the food environment? May I ask Selena to start once more?
Yes, absolutely. So I think looking ahead and really trying to promote food quality in terms of biochemical composition and sensory attributes as an attribute that is provided to consumers in the food environment. What is needed is more research and accessibility to actually measure biochemical composition and food quality in a standardized way. So researchers around the world are using different protocols for this, and oftentimes those protocols aren't standardized. And so I think really looking ahead is coming to a global consensus in terms of standardized protocols. And so then those that are in the food environment, managing food environments, can have this common language when they're communicating with consumers as well as with farmers. So I think really a common language around food quality, crop quality is really, really important going forward. The other element is thinking about the role. So there's multiple frameworks on food environments, and very few frameworks really emphasize sustainability as an attribute of the food environment or foods in the food environment. And so common aspects of food environments that are measured is food availability, food accessibility, food price or food affordability, food convenience, as well as food desirability, and food quality. And sustainability is not really a common element in different food environment frameworks. And so when we're really wanting to promote foods in the food environment that contribute to planetary health and to human well-being, as well as to cultural heritage of communities and populations around the world, I think having an understanding of how to measure and communicate about sustainability as an attribute of foods in the food environment is really important. And then in taking this very systems and holistic approach, I think it's really important to have measures across the food system, across value chains that are aligned. And so, we think about agrobiodiversity, and we think about biodiversity, and we think about dietary diversity and market food diversity in food environments, or diversity of offerings in the food environment, thinking about how we can align all of these measures. So when we are having interventions, they can be aligned and we can really see the impacts that these different interventions have. Again, having a common language globally for researchers and practitioners and policymakers around that. And then my last point is what Jessica mentioned, and I'm going to restate it because I think it's so critical, is thinking about the unintended consequences, in the food system for all decisions that we take. And, thinking about underutilized species. I think the promotion of underutilized species is so important and so inspiring, but it also has to be taken into account in a really, really mindful way. In many cases, it's indigenous populations that are the stewards of this knowledge, of this intellectual property of these resources. And we want to make sure that that is protected and that there's fair access and benefit sharing and equity when there is knowledge that's shared about those resources. And so really thinking about the unintended consequences, in research and in the promotion of underutilized species. And so I think having a framework going forward of how can we promote underutilized species and attributes of these species in ways that really protect indigenous knowledge and communities. Yeah, those are my points. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel.
Thank you so much, Selena. So you covered now quite a number of issues, but I think the one on measures and other common language is so much key, and we all should look out always for definitions. How do others define it and see things? So may I ask Jessica now to give your remarks.
Yes, and I just want to I agree with everything that Selena's just said. I think there's so many elements that she brought into the discussion there that are so important. I'm just reflecting on the sort of how research has evolved in the last few years, and it's been so encouraging to see how nutrition has really come into all of this work around value chains, and prioritizing nutrition has become a central element in a lot of work around value chains. And now I would really like to see that sort of same emphasis come into the food environment work. The food environment where people every day interact with the food system is such a key leverage point for influencing nutrition and health outcomes. And I don't feel like we've really tapped into that potential yet. All of those attributes that Selena mentioned around accessibility, availability, affordability, sustainability, desirability, quality, convenience, all of those elements there, that it's really important that we have a consistent sort of way of measuring those attributes in those food environments. That means that we can sort of examine them across contexts and how they change over time. One thing I wanted to mention, we've talked, a lot about the retail food environment, which is sort of one of the most obvious ones that comes to mind. And then we also talked a bit about cultivated food environments and wild food environments that are so crucial in so many contexts. And we've done some recent work in the Pacific region where we're talking about sort of the kin and community food environment as well. It's sort of an informal setting where people, rely on trading and exchanging food with family, extended community members, and it's some of these informal places where food is exchanged that it's difficult to sort of measure in a scientific sense, but it is really important part of food acquisition and food consumption patterns in many parts of the world. So I think that's an area that really needs a lot more attention. I also wanted to mention the importance of convenience. Convenience is one of the most commonly cited drivers of dietary choices in contexts all over the world, and we really don't have consistent methods and tools and approaches for understanding how we can improve convenience. I think there's so much that can be done to improve convenience of healthy foods, and that's a real leverage point that we sort of need to look into more in food system approaches to nutrition. And again, just sort of making sure that as we're doing this work, that we're always mindful of potential trade-offs and unintended consequences of intervening in local food systems. I'll leave it there, but thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, also very important point, the convenience, for example. Yeah, then I would like to ask Laurence, would you like to share with us your future suggestions for the future research gaps?
Yes, thank you very much. So I cannot agree more with the two predecessors, Selena and Jessica. I think all the points they raised are important. I just would like to highlight that I really think that more research should be put on local and national domestic food system and value chain. There is a lot of research on global value chains, much less of what is happening at domestic local level. So it's very important, and for example, looking at the markets, so looking at what is happening in the local market, farmers market, it's part of the food environment, but there is very few data about this. Looking at the small and medium enterprises, informal sector, street vendors, etc. All these people that are living from food processing or food trading, etc. And there is not so much data about them. They are also lacking support. So a lot of research and support should be provided to this kind of enterprises to be able to invest more in logistics, storage, etc., reduce food loss and waste. This is also a very important topic when we are talking about agrobiodiversity. But I would just like to highlight also another point. Even if we are talking more here about the open market, we are also considering that the public sector have an important role to play. And when talking about public sector, I would like to refer to public food procurement. Even if public procurement is a small share of the market, is still a very powerful tool to change the food system, to show the way, to change the food system at their own level, and to show the way also to influence, for example, in schools, to influence children by showing the importance of agrobiodiversity in schools, in the school canteens, school gardens, etc. So all these tools are very important, and they are accessible for government to do, and they can open the way for the other food system to be influenced by this experience. So we are really pushing forward on this, and hoping that sustainable food, public food procurement could be a good example of for changing and inspiring the food system and introducing more agrobiodiversity in them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurence, and especially encouraging research on this local and domestic food value change. I think this is so important. So, yeah, last but not least, move to Federico. Would you like to share with us your future action?
I will say something and then immediately contradict myself, and I understand this contradiction in what I say. I think, as I was saying before, the role of consumers is incredibly important. I think every time we decide, every time we buy something, or rather when we decide what to buy, it is a political act. And through our consumption patterns, we shape production paradigms. Slow Food calls them co-producers rather than consumers to highlight this. At the same time, and here comes the contradiction, I think both in regards to sustainable food systems and, for example, climate change, there is a kind of unjust expectation that consumers, that the single citizen takes all the responsibility of avoiding these impacts of promoting sustainable food systems. And I think policymakers, the public sector, whatever we want to call it, plays a crucial role. And without that role, whatever the consumer does is pretty useless. Selena mentioned the public procurement, which is a great example. Things like, for example, the taxation of negative externalities and the subsidies to positive externalities is another one, because or else we don't have an understanding of the real cost of food. We have a different kind of cost. Also simple things like urban planning, or rather not simple, but things like urban planning and nutritional deserts. You might not be able to access physically that good, clean, fair food. So I think while consumers have an incredibly important role to play, they must not be left alone. There has to be that enabling environment in which their choices, their consumption patterns make a difference, or else it's useless. I would also like to add one thing that Florence, which I agree with Florence, she mentioned, is food, good, clean, fair food must not be something for the middle classes or for the rich. It has to be for everyone. And when we think of transforming food systems, we have to start with the global south, or at least do it simultaneously. It must not be the upper class people and middle class people in rich countries that are able to access good, clean food. It must be everyone, and we must do this at a world level, starting with the most vulnerable, the most affected, as we think things like the double burden and so forth, and really try to focus on a bottom-up approach and seeing how we can create something which is resilient, sustainable, and hopefully impactful, bringing in together all the different stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you
Now,
so
Federico.
much from my side. Now
Yeah.
I hand over to you, Irmgard.
Thank you, Gudrun. Sorry for interrupting you there, but it was overwhelming now what you all said. And there are great comments also in the Q&A session. We will not be able to address now these last questions, but maybe you just take them into the next session where there also will be very interesting talks. Now, let me summarize a little bit what I took home. I think based also on some comments, I would highlight something Shakuntala pointed at. It's these food-based dietary guidelines, which may also play a big role, according to the comments in the Q&A session, following up some on your recommendations. Right? Look locally and look at what is actually available and include these into the dietary guidelines to better communicate what the richness, the resources we have. But we also have to acknowledge that our main resource, what we really have to foster and maintain, is the genetic diversity. So it starts all over with seed availability and the production side, where we have to support farmers, but also indigenous people. And there another sidetrack, please follow up on the indigenous people session later in the day, because I think there is where we also can feed into and learn a lot from. There is what I noticed, attention about tension. There was the idea that there is actually a tension which we need to solve, but at the same time, there was a comment, is it really tension, or do we should actually manage the challenge better we face? Because we do have different interests in the players we have. It's the policymakers, it's the farmers who would like to have a livelihood. It's the consumer who would like to participate in the global world, but at the same time needs to learn also needs or maybe acknowledges what they have at local level. There's where Federico's comment was like, let's travel to the rural area and see what they have. But also vice versa. That's what be my recommendation. Let allow the rural people to learn what the urban people are doing wrong, or what they do actually nicely when it comes to inventing novel foods based on traditional knowledge and traditional foods. In the end, we remain in a challenge because we have a challenge in interests. And this may be called tension in that case, because everybody would like to earn something from what we have. In the end, you want to become rich and purchase shoes, and have a nice livelihood. And I think that's what we should not forget in the whole system. But if we foster indigenous knowledge, that's what I understood from you. If we foster dietary diversity, we will be very rich. because we may actually have then a much better livelihood in terms of also the impact on climate change, what food environment is actually harming and contributing to. In the end, my take-home message was think global, act local, which has implications on what we actually do, but maybe something what we can do. It's not a concrete, I mean, acting local seems to be weird if there's nothing there. No? Federico was mentioning, we sometimes have food deserts. So maybe we start in looking into the next session with the idea in mind, eat a different vegetable each day in a week. And you may just reflect your own diet and see whether you are actually eating each day a different vegetable. If possible, even each day a different one across a month, because we have this rich, looking at the abstracts now, we have seen the sessions there. We have a richness in food, but we don't utilize it yet. By this, I would like to thank you for all your participations, and thank you, Gudrun, for your patience with me interrupting her. And thank you to the organizers as well and your great participation. I see comments are coming in. We still have to work on some of the ideas. And yeah, pass on to Gudrun for a final remark. Thank you.
Oh, well, I just said already my thank you, so I can just echo Irmgard once more. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you very much to the organizers and to a marvelous team in the background. Without it, would not work. And I think we're just in time to jump into the next session. So maybe just run to get something to drink or a fruit or a healthy snack in between. And see you in the next session then. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Hello, and welcome to the second International Agrobiodiversity Congress session on consumer awareness and healthy diets under the overall theme of increased consumption of agrobiodiversity. So my name is Gina Kennedy, and I'll be the moderator for this session. We have a really nice program lined up for you. To start off, we're going to listen to 5 pre-recorded research presentations. And while we do that, you can go ahead and type any questions you have for the presenters into the chat box in Whova. And please indicate which presenter your question is for. And then the presenters can be answering you as we go along, or they'll answer you at another time using the Whova platform. And then after we have the abstract presentations, we will hear reflections from a panel of 4 experts. And then after that, there's going to be an open discussion session where you can provide your own reflections, or you can ask panel members different questions. So it's with my great pleasure that we are in this session today on consumer awareness. We know that it's not only about supply of healthy foods to create healthier diets and more sustainable food systems, but all of us as consumers have a large part to play in the choices that we make every day about the foods that we eat. So it's a very large research space and programmatic and policy area to be thinking about. What do we do to change consumer choices, consumer awareness, and ultimately behaviors of consumers to have healthier people and a healthier planet? Okay, so I think that we can just go ahead. I'll start and by introducing the first 3 abstract presenters. We have Mint Tutu Ong, who's a junior researcher from the University of Bonn, and Naji Sulaman, a PhD candidate at the Czech University of Life Sciences in Prague. And Naji will be followed by Marika Ferrari. So we'll go ahead and listen to those 3 presentations and then have a little break, and I'll introduce the next 2 speakers.
Good evening. My name is Duduang. I'm doing PhD at University of Bonn with the financial support of senior projects. Today, I'm presenting from Myanmar about consumer attitude toward entomophagies in Myanmar. Entomophagies nowadays become a popular topic, so eatable insects had to receive mass interest at food in non-entomophagous country. But entomophagies have been decreasing in traditional insect-eating country. Myanmar is one of the insect-eating country where variety or one gathering insects covering a wide range of biodiversity are consumed as food and medicine. But it is difficult to know the market potential or eatable insects due to lack of research into consumer perception. So this study aimed to explore the consumer perception or eatable insects in Myanmar by answering what are the consumer attitude toward entomophagies and if influencing factor. The data of 863 respondents were collected through telephone interview, and data were analyzed using discrete and binary logistic methods. According to consumer response, more than 99% of the respondents are familiar with eatable insects. 60% of the respondents discard the eatable insects. 20% of the respondents fear the eatable insects. 97% of the respondents said that fish and meat are available in their areas. According to 93% of the respondents, eatable insects are seasonally available in their areas. 73% of the respondents have insect consumption experience, but 59% of the respondents show negative attitude toward entomophages. This table shows biologistic results, attitude towards smart using 14 independent variables, regions, age, family size, discard, and consumption experience show significant relationship with attitude. All three show that how much the off or attitude change for each unique change in independent variable. Less than one means negative relationships and more than one means positive relationships. According to marginal effect, the higher the marginal effect, the more probable of having positive attitude. For region, the marginal effect is negative 0.147. So there is 50% lower the probable of having positive attitude for the people who live in Upper Nema than Lower Nema. The highest marginal effect was shown by consumption experience. So there is 35% higher the probability of having positive attitude for the people who have experience on insect consumption. In sum, eatable insect and nutritional food may have the potential to the reduction of malnutrition in nematode. The negative attitude due to discard could be mitigated by increasing transparency of the entire chain. And food safety guidelines should be established by the government, and it should be practiced by all value chain players of eatable insects. Moreover, overharvesting should be avoided in order to preserve biodiversity. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. My name is Naji Suleiman. I'm greeting you from Prague, Czech Republic. I'm a PhD candidate at the Czech University of Life Sciences, Prague. I will present about ethnogastronomy of wartime, wild plants used for human nutrition during the conflict in Syria. Our research questions were, firstly, how has the conflict in Syria affected the use of wild plants? Secondly, what wild plants are used during the conflict? The main purpose of our study was to understand the conflict impact on the consumption pattern of wild food plants. Our objectives were, firstly, to uncover the conflict's effect on the use of wild food plants. Secondly, to conduct an inventory of the wild plant species used as a food in the study area. By the way, the study area was in the coastal region of Syria, bordering the Mediterranean Sea, and Lebanon in the south, and Turkey in the north. Thirdly, or the third objective, was to document the ethnobotanical knowledge, including modes of preparation and consumption. The main outcomes in our study were that 64% of informants reported an increase in their reliance on wild plants as a source of food during the conflict, comparing to the pre-conflict time. That means that almost 2/3 of our informants were relying more on wild plants as a food source during the conflict. We have to highlight here that the study area basically is not affected much. It's relatively quiet, let's say, during the Syrian conflict, but it's significantly impacted by, let's say, the economic crisis resulting from the ongoing conflict in Syria. We understand from that people are unable to afford the market products. Not always, but basically there is difficulty in buying the food from market. So people are relying more on wild food plants as a food source. The second outcome in our study were that we documented around 75 wild plant species used for food and beverage preparation by the local people, which comparing to the other studies in Eastern Mediterranean considered as high diversity, let's say, in use of wild plants. And the main, let's say, wild species were used as a food. Firstly, Origanum syriacum, which used for za'atar preparation. Za'atar is a local dish prepared mainly for breakfast and dinner meals. Rus coraria or sumac, it's kind of spices. It has a sour astringent taste. It's also main ingredient of za'atar, and it's also added to salads and other kind of food. Rhingium triticum, it's used also for salad preparation. Arum maculatum, it's mainly used for some kind of winter soup prepared. Is called loof in the local language. The research contribution to our meeting here and to the Congress that wild edible plants play a crucial role in human nutrition when conventional food is limited due to emergency situations such as natural disasters or conflicts, as the situation now in Syria. We have to highlight that wild edible plants contribute significantly to food diversity, to food safety also, and also as a micronutrient source. Many of our reported wild food plants, after we reviewed the literature, we found many of them are rich in antioxidants, in minerals, in vitamins. So it's very important for human nutrition. And it's also as a part of biocultural heritage. And it's also a main part of the cultural identity, let's say, since it's something traditional. People are using there since hundreds or even thousands of years. Also, that traditional knowledge, which basically the use of wild plants are based on, is related to wild food plants. This traditional knowledge has to be preserved. But how? There is like a question which brings us to a very long discussion. But we can say that by raising awareness on the importance of wild food plants, by probably to be taught in schools for students, these wild plants are part of the cultural, biocultural heritage, and also could be important for in the future in case of any crisis. It could also serve as a food source. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to thank all the study participants and all everyone who had a hand in this, especially the who provided consultations, such as Prof. Andrea Pironi, Prof. Renata Sukand, and Dr. Corey Whitney. Thank you very much.
My name is Marica Ferrari, and I'm a researcher at the Council of Agricultural Research and Economics, specifically in the Research Center of Food and Nutrition. The title of my presentation is Optimized Dietary Patterns for the Achievement of Nutritional and Environmental Goals. The research question in this study is what combination of foods in the diet provides optimal nutrition at the lowest environmental impact. Then the purpose of the studies was to define the optimal daily portions of foods that could minimize gas emissions while maintaining as much as possible an adequate nutritional intake. The specific objectives was to develop an optimized diet for the adult Italian population, thus defining a nutritionally optimal food consumption pattern able to meet the national recommendations intakes and with the minimum greenhouse gas emissions impact. The second specific objective was to investigate the impact of an optimized diet, likely to be low in meat and dairy products, in terms of the coverage of requirements for selected nutrients for which these products are important contributors in the current Italian diet. The results was show that it's possible to develop an Italian low environment impact diet model on observed consumption data able to cover nutritional needs and to reduce greenhouse gas emission by up to 50%, and therefore to actively contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 and 2050. In addition, the proposed diet model provides a transition from a diet with a high animal-based foods, in particular bread and processed meat, to a diet very rich in plant-based foods, such as fruits, vegetables, especially legumes, and cereals, with a greater amount of milk and yogurt. Finally, the study demonstrated that the calcium, vitamin B12 in both gender and iron in female are the critical nutrients in achieving nutritional coverage in the transition to a low environment impact diet model. The contribution of these results to the Congress refer the daily weekly recommendation on the type of foods consumed, specifically in terms of red and white meat, fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grain, processed food, and sugar, to give indication for a new dietary advice on healthy and sustainable diets, to ensure synergy among policies of different ministers, for example, health, agricultural, and education. In addition, the result of the studies give input for the development.
Hi everyone, my name is Eli Kuku from Benin, PhD student in Human Nutrition and Food Security at the University of Abomey-Calavi. I'm very happy to share with you the work titled Seasonal Variation in the Dietary Contribution of Wild Foods to Children's Diet in 2 agroecological zones of rural southern Benin. Questions targeted here are: what are the contributions of wild food to micronutrient intakes from the diet of infant and young children, and how these contributions vary between plenty and lean season? As purpose, we want to explore the link between wild agrobiodiversity and nutrition by assessing their contribution to children's diet across seasons. The first objective was to determine the contribution of wild foods to vitamin A, vitamin C, iron, zinc, folate, and calcium intake of the diet of children in agroecological zones 6 and 8, and then analyze seasonal variation in the contribution of wild food to micronutrient intakes. Ottawa funds mixed beta regression model were implemented to explore seasonality of these contributions. So beyond season, covariates such as agroecological zone, age, energy intake, breastfeeding status, and sex of children were added to the model. For vitamin A, for example, we observed that from plenty to lean season, vitamin A contribution from wild foods decreased by an average of 75%. This contribution also was lower in agroecological zone 6 than in agroecological zone 8 by an average of 60–80%. It also decreased with age by 80% for an increase of 1 month in age. This effect of age increase in lean season and in agroecological zone 6 than respectively plenty season and agroecological zone 8. Adjusted mean of this contribution so that these contributions are low, but are high in plenty season than in lean season. These results are in line with Bodeke and colleagues who found low contribution of wild edible plants to micronutrients from women dead during dry season in Benin. Conversely, Powell and colleagues found high contribution of wild food to vitamin A, vitamin C, and iron intake among Tanzanian mother and children during wet season. This study captured the role of wild foods in the death of children in rural Benin. So awareness rural population on the importance of using and consuming wild food to better combat micronutrient deficiencies and reduce nutritional transition problems could allow them to better understand and leverage agrobiodiversity for healthy diets and improving income for these populations. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Anna Diakonu, and today I'm sharing the integration of indigenous values as a catalyst for healthier diets among agroecological farmers in Ecuador. And this was part of our quest to answer the question, does agroecology promote nutritional health among farmers, and if so, how? Agroecology is internationally recognized as a sustainable farming strategy, and one of its central tenets is the increase in biodiversity on the farm. Now, in Ecuador, agroecology is largely comprised of indigenous farmers, many of whom are living in difficult socioeconomic circumstances on marginalized lands and who have multiple forms of malnutrition. Now, agroecology in Ecuador did not emerge with the objective of resolving nutritional problems among participating farmers. However, the farmers started to realize that food is not just what we grow, but also, of course, what we eat as farmers. And if we are growing a greater diversity of healthy products as part of our agroecological farming strategy, well, we're also eating those products and likely we're accessing better nutritional health. So our research team worked together with agroecological farmers to understand whether or not this was indeed the case. We used a mixed methods approach with both qualitative and quantitative components. And one of these key components was a survey in which we compared agroecological farmers with reference farmers, who were essentially the non-agroecological neighbors of the agroecological farmers. And these methods allowed us to have some pretty interesting results. For example, in our comparison of agroecological and reference farmers, we found that agroecological farmers had performed better on our dietary diversity score, which was a proxy for nutrient adequacy. And they also performed better on our measure of food moderation, wherein they consumed a smaller percentage of their total daily calories from processed foods, and thereby were able to avoid certain harmful nutrient excesses. So in sum, agroecological farmers had healthier diets than reference farmers. Now, why was this the case? Well, we also found that agroecological farmers had greater production diversity, and this was, of course, no surprise given that this was a central tenet of agroecology. But when we did some regression analyses, we, of course, also found that there was a positive relationship between production diversity and dietary diversity. Now, I say, of course, because this has been assessed in many contexts, and this relationship has been detected multiple times. But we also found that agroecological farmers had a greater consumption of foods from non-market food sources, meaning they got a greater percentage of their daily calories from their own production and from the social economy, which includes gifting, barter, and purchase from other local farmers. Whereas reference farmers got more of their daily calories from conventional market sources. This was interesting because consuming from these non-market food sources had a positive relationship with dietary moderation. So we found these results to be quite interesting in understanding the how behind why agroecological farmers have healthier diets, but we also wanted to discuss this directly with agroecological farmers themselves through our qualitative methods. And in these discussions, we got some very interesting insights on why agroecological farmers make healthier food choices. And a large part of this had to do with their interest in exerting their indigenous identity through agroecology. And this came across in both their production and consumption choices. For example, they adopted agroecology as a production paradigm largely because they found that this was a way of supporting Pachamama, or Mother Earth. And they chose to consume from their own production because this was also largely linked to their means of exerting their indigenous identity and also of consuming the traditional products that are a part of this identity. And so we found that this was very interesting because in this case, the drivers of healthy food choices were not just health in itself, but rather healthy food choices were very closely related to cultural decisions in this population. And we found that this has interesting lessons for other groups of people or other populations where health is not the only reason that people would make a healthy food decision. With that, I'd like to thank you, and I also leave my contact information here, and I look forward to discussing further with everyone on this panel.
so much to Mayent, Naji, Marika, Ellie, and Anna for those really wonderful abstracts and research presentations. Lots for us to think about, digest, maybe even chew on. There's certainly quite a lot of important themes coming out around neglected and underutilized species, seasonality within food systems, also the sustainability of our production and consumption patterns. I also just, liked hearing a couple important themes, like specifically for insects, we were hearing about the need for desirability and maybe the opposite of desirability, disgust or lack of trust or fear and safety. I also really liked hearing about market availability and affordability, optimizing healthy diets, and some of the reasons why farmers in Ecuador would prefer to consume a traditional dietary pattern, and it's not necessarily at the top of their minds as public health nutritionists would have it, that it's good for you, but because it's their cultural identity. So it's really important to understand what's driving consumers to make the choices that they're making. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce this fantastic panel of speakers. And we have about 30 minutes to hear from the speakers on their experiences, what they think's work to change consumer demand and consumer awareness, and drawing lessons from the abstracts and their own experience. And then also maybe what do we need to do next? We can also talk about what hasn't worked. So it's just a nice open space for us to hear experiences from these esteemed panel members. So I'll introduce them one by one and then ask the first question. We have Malek Batal, who is a PhD fellow at the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He's professor at University of Montreal's Faculty of Medicine and School of Public Health, and director of the WHO Collaborating Center on Nutrition Changes and Development. He holds the Canada Research Chair in Nutrition and Health Inequalities and conducts participatory research studying the link between environment, food system health, and population health. I think also importantly, Malek works in the transdisciplinary research team with the First Nations in Canada and Indigenous peoples and rural people internationally. And I know that there either was or will be a session on Indigenous people, so that's really great. We also have Molly Hearn. So I've had the pleasure of working with Molly while at Bioversity. She joined FAO and the Fisheries Division based in Rome, Italy in 2019. She's a food security and nutrition specialist, so really multidisciplinary and bringing nutrition into agriculture, especially aquaculture. She's worked previously for World Fish and Bioversity International, and she's worked on nutrition-sensitive value chains for fish and development of fish products for nutrition interventions in the first 1,000 days, and also on nutrition education programs, and worked in Zambia and Costa Rica, in addition to what she's doing right now with FAO in Rome. We also have Daniela Pinafil. She's a professor and researcher at the Escuela Superior Politécnica del Litoral, and her special interests are in sustainable indicators related to human nutrition and rural development. She has studied at the Escuela Superior Politécnica Litoral and also in University of New York, Wageningen University, Ghent University. She's also worked at Bioversity. She works with vulnerable communities on qualitative analysis of perceptions around the conservation of natural resources in Ecuador and sustainable diets. Her PhD research focused on evidence, the contribution of forest foods and traditional diets to the diversity of diets and nutrient intake. So welcome, Danielle. And lastly, we have Lydia Waswa, who is joining us from Kenya. She is a lecturer at Egerton University, and she works in the Department of Human Nutrition. Lydia's interests are dietary diversity using agrobiodiversity and she's particularly focused on maternal and child health, especially complementary feeding of children 6 to 23 months of age. And she also has particular experience in increasing nutrition knowledge, especially around agrobiodiversity. So welcome to all of the panel speakers. Our first question is just a key reflection that you might have from one or more of the abstracts presented. So did you notice a key theme, or was anything that struck you that was really innovative or important from any of the abstracts? So Malek, let's begin with you. I think you'll need to unmute yourself and give us your reflection.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you to all the presenters. It was very interesting. A thought I was having as I was listening to everyone was how important the intersection between culture and biodiversity was in the presentations, and how key the heritage in the case of the wild plants, or the importance of the indigenous culture in the case of Ecuador. These were, and I think you mentioned it, Gina, in your comment. I think promoting biodiversity or agrobiodiversity seems to go through a promotion of some cultural or heritage foods, and I think this is important when we want to try and understand how those foods are consumed or not. And the other thing I noticed is the importance of looking at the diet and nutrition from a dietary diversity and a micronutrient lens, rather than a macronutrient lens or an energy lens, particularly when we're talking about wild plants. These are usually small contributors to total energy, but they are important contributors to other nutrients that are key. And so when we're talking about times of difficulty, times of war, etc., we have in mind energy sufficiency, of course, but we also need to have in mind micronutrient sufficiency. And I think these elements, these foods are very important in that case. I think that's what struck me, how, just to summarize, like how important working with heritage when we're talking about these foods, and not necessarily promoting them as a new solution, but as a rediscovered traditional solution that can be promoted de novo.
Great. Thanks a lot, Malek, for those really great reflections on the intersection of culture and agrobiodiversity, and also that we also need to focus on nutrition security, not just food security. And we get a lot of our nutrition security from these underutilized agrobiodiverse species. Thanks. So next up is, I believe, Molly.
Yeah, and there was a lot of really interesting research presented in these abstracts. I just wanted to reflect on a theme that I kind of saw across a couple of the different abstracts, at looking at diversity for resilience, and in the example from Syria, where they highlighted that wild foods were used during specific times of the year. And then also in the example from Benin, looking at the seasonality of various foods, and that, for example, vitamin A rich foods, I think that they highlighted, were available during times of lower food availability of other foods. And looking at not only the diversity of foods, but also diversity of the sources of food. So not just from the farm or the home garden, but also from the wild. And in the example of fisheries and aquaculture, some work that I previously worked on with Gina in relation to seasonality was looking at the availability of fish throughout different seasons in relation to other animal source foods. And we saw that actually in some periods, like during fishing bans or during rainy season, when fish aren't as highly available, people were relying on other wild foods such as mice or insects. So relating also back to the work in Myanmar that was mentioned. So this seasonality that was mentioned in Benin is really important in terms of planning strategies, but then also looking at monitoring and evaluation of different projects and making sure that we understand the different methods of gathering foods and food systems, but also the diversity of foods and food systems that contribute to resilience.
Thank you, Molly. Really nice reflections. I like how you're bringing in resilience and how seasonality is an important factor also in resilience. Next, let's hear from Lydia.
Thank you, Gina. Okay. I couldn't agree more with Malik and Molly that we can wrap off that biodiversity and all this diversity of foods do not only contribute to food security, but to nutritional security, and that it's important to not only target communities and to see that they need to satisfy their energy needs, but this hidden hunger and that we are being facing and fighting for many years. These local species and traditional species are the stronger contributors to that. I will also say that from the speakers that we have to measure these species a little more specifically, because when we wrap them off into food groups, we see that we only work with 10 food groups, basically. But when we go to Africa, Asia, Latin American countries, these food groups can go to food items up to what we saw the study of Malek in Ecuador. We can go up to 30, 40, 50, and even the studies that we made before also with Biodiversity International, we saw that these numbers can really rise, and that each of these items and each of these species contribute to different nutrients, and it's the variety of them and the mixtures on their eating cultures that contribute finally to the diets of local people. And in that remains also important with things get really bad, not only in the seasons, but like in emergency situations. We saw also during the COVID pandemic here in Ecuador and for example in Galapagos Island, people did not have all the resources that what they had on the wild edibles and other species that they thought they would not record, and this was the only source of food that they could have in those difficult times.
Thank you, Daniela. And now, Lydia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to the presenters for the sharing. So in terms of reflection from the different presenters, what is coming out is that in terms of accessibility and even availability of these wild foods, they are there and they are unique for every community. You find what is accepted in one community may not be accepted in another community, but I want to say from the presentation that there's a variety of these wild edible fruits or insects, etc., in different regions. And also what is coming out is that most of these people know that these foods are there because in one of the abstracts, they're able to document even 75 different types of fruits which are available. So people know them, and depending on the locality. And also in one of the abstracts, people consume them, but the major issue is the attitude. So the issue here is the consumer. It's not really that the foods are not there. To some extent, the foods are there. The issue of abundance may not really be the problem here. The issue here is how do we get the consumer to consume these foods or to maximize on these foods, the potential of these foods. So what is coming out is there are other factors interplaying in the background, which maybe now we need to think about. For example, the issue of disgust here, because you can see those foods were used, for example, in Benin, when there's war, they were used to supplement, meaning they can be consumed. But the issue here is how can we have sustained consumption of these foods? How can we move from just knowing them, eating them once, but to make it a habit, a practice on a continuous basis? Bearing in mind now the other issues of seasonality and the cultural issue. How do we sustain the consumption of these foods? So that is one thing that was coming out for me. It's to do with the consumer, him or herself. How do we make them think about these foods? When it comes to think about food, think about those locally available foods. Then the other thing is then how do we address those factors that could be affecting the consumption? Because several things have come here, the issue of seasonality, but you'll find that even in different seasons, we have some kinds of foods which are available during that season, which they can also tap on. So are consumers aware of those alternative foods available during that particular season? So how do we make them aware that during this season, this is available, during this season, this is available. You can use this during this season, next season you can use this. So how do we bring the consumer to be able to change? And then now coupled with the transition, the whole world is experiencing a transition from the traditional way of eating to the modern way of eating. How do we find a balance? How do we still get these traditional foods on our diets, on our plates, and still appreciate them because they contribute significantly to micronutrient intake? So how do we change the consumer's lens, how they look at this food? I think that is what struck me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Really fantastic reflections. I couldn't agree with you more on your comments about mostly, I mean, it's not universal, but mostly consumers are pretty aware of the resources. And even, I think most consumers are aware, for example, that fruits and vegetables are good for you. That's knowledge that most people, have. And so recently in my experience, we were really trying to look at small factors that would influence consumer demand. And one of the small factors that really came out was taste. So consumers are driven by, I want something that is going to be tasty for me. We also know there are other really small factors like convenience. I need something that I can prepare for my family after work. That's not going to take me hours and hours. And what we need to do, I think, is get better at translating those consumer factors into our work, as public health nutritionists. And that's very difficult. I think it's a mindset for a lot of us who work in the field, because our first go-to is just, well, the consumer needs to be educated about how good these are for them. And I don't think that is really going to be working anymore. We need to evolve ourselves as well to understand better what it is the consumer wants. So our second question is, in your own work, I just gave you an example from my work where taste was very important to the consumer, and we needed to shift our program away from just telling people how good it is for you, because that's not like a really good seller for the consumer. So do you have an example of where you tried to sway consumer choice to something more nutritious, more agrobiodiverse, and what worked or didn't work in your experiences with your projects? So we're going to begin with Molly to answer that question.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think I'll speak more specifically about aquatic foods. And I know yesterday in the keynote speech, Shakuntala Thilsted highlighted the importance of diversifying even within aquatic foods beyond the kind of commercialized species and looking at lower trophic species such as small pelagic fish and seaweeds and bivalve mollusks and different foods that may not be as highly consumed in places like the US and Europe, but are really important to local food systems in Africa or Asia, for example. And we did some work a couple years ago, actually, in Zambia and Malawi on nutrition sensitive fish value chains, trying to look at how to better include fish into diets of young children and women of reproductive age to diversify diets during that first 1,000 days of life. And one of the things that came out in the beginning was that fish is not traditionally part of young children's diets, that maybe they consume the broth after boiling fish or after cooking the fish, but that the full fish isn't traditionally part of the diet. So one of the things that we found really important was looking at demand-driven solutions, how making sure that fish products are going to be liked, number one, by young children and acceptable to young children and within the community, and looking at consumption patterns in the community and different traditional dishes that fish could be incorporated into. So one of the products that was a bit, I think, quite successful in that it was versatile, it could be used in young children's foods, but also in family foods, was fish powder. And this, in terms of versatility, was, I think, quite successful because fish powder could be added to many different dishes, not only vegetables, but actually we went back to the community about a year later after the first intervention, and people were adding fish powder to cakes and different baked products. So it was quite cool to see that it had evolved a bit, and people found their own solutions for their own recipes for fish powder.
Thanks, Molly. That was a great example from your own work and experiences, particularly of the product being something desirable and also versatile and convenient. And probably there was a large factor that product didn't contain bones, so people weren't so concerned about feeding it to young children. So Daniela, how about an experience from your work where you really tried to work on a consumer attribute?
Well, from my experience, I've been working with different traditional indigenous communities in Ecuador. So for those who have been in Ecuador, we have the Amazons, we have the highlands, and we have Galapagos, and we also have the coastal region. And they all eat different species and different dishes. But in terms of promoting healthy eating and consumption, what was more successful for us and for our undergrads, which are nutrition specialists, was to promote healthy eating behaviors that were already there. So what we did in the beginning was to send our students to get to know what was the traditional diet, because they were not familiar themselves, because indigenous people, they have this culturally, it lingers from one generation to the other. So the first step was to send students to document all these behaviors, the preparation, and the diversity of ingredients in a dish. And then they use this into nutrition education booklets, videos, work groups, and then they promoted something that was already there, but they just try to make other people engage into not losing this knowledge. And it lingered from the new generation, so the little children were promoting their parents to eat what their grandparents ate. And it was successful. It was also super fun for us and for our students to see that normally research does not have to be always measuring and reporting, but it was being there with the community, and we increase dietary diversity, we increase species as a food variety scores, and then we are waiting to see if children are getting higher for the age in a large set of time. We continue to go back to these communities a year after another, and it was a pretty nice and successful start for me.
Great example. Thank you so much, Daniela. Lydia, over to you. do you have an example from your own work of how you're working with consumers? And is it successful, or we don't know yet?
Okay. We've been working with rural farming households in Western Kenya, and with the aim of promoting not only consumption, but starting with the production. Because from the surveys we have done, we realized that in terms of the kinds of foods which are produced, maybe a narrow base, but in terms of what is available in the community, it's quite wide. So the issue here is, if you're working in such a community where they believe that, okay, let me use that community as an example. In that community, and also maybe by virtue where I come from, Western Kenya, if there is no maize, there is no food. So when we talk of food, it's synonymous with maize. So changing the perspective of the people in the community there, we did focus group discussion to understand the seasonal availability of different foods, and the results indicated that there's a variety available. But the issue now here is what is consumed. Despite what is available, very minimal, or whatever variety is consumed is very small. And so we went through the trials for improved practices and tried to promote some practices. For example, one of the practices was to consume at least a different vegetable each day of the week, because from what we saw, they only consume the same vegetable, but within even the same food group, there are there are different kinds of vegetables. So we encourage them to consume a different vegetable. And then we also had to understand why don't they consume maybe different vegetables, and got the reasons. Some of them is cultural, some is seasonality, some is availability. And therefore we went further and now did the cooking trials, cooking demonstrations, trying to show them how to cook different vegetables. Those ones which maybe they had a negative attitude, maybe they are bitter, maybe they're not tasty, etc. We try to combine them so that we can have a better taste, etc. And then now they're able to try out these recipes themselves, testing these vegetables, different recipes, improved recipes, etc. So from those results, we saw a number really appreciating that it is possible to consume some vegetables which initially they would not consume, because they have been shown how to even prepare them, how to grow them on their farms. And then they have tested, I think as we've just shared, they change the way they think about these vegetables. And so many more were able to now consume different kinds of vegetables. Though, even having done that, the issue that to some level during the trial, it works. But as I said earlier, how do we motivate them to continue doing it? The issue of something intrinsic, some motivation is what now we are trying to figure out. How do we make it sustainable? Because they will do it for some time, but then after some time they will stop. So how do we make it interesting for them to continue? So that is now the barrier. In terms of understanding, knowing, yes, they know. Appreciating that, yes, there is so much that we can consume, yes, they know. So now, I don't know if I went back after 1 year, if they would still be doing the same thing. So how do we have this intrinsic motivation coming from within to drive them to consume? So that is now where we are now. So we look forward to going back to find out what is happening. Yes, thank you.
That's a great example, Lydia. I really appreciate that example, and how we need to move to the next step of really measuring how sustainable and embedded these ideas become within the populations that we're working together with. So Malek, you're up for your experiences in this topic.
Thank you, Gina. I think I'm going to draw from two experiences. One in a project in Lebanon more than 10 years ago that was promoting wild edible plants as a way to improve nutrition security. And the other is my ongoing work with First Nations in Canada around traditional food, so hunting, gathering, fishing. And I think what does not work is to assume that barriers are individual, that what prevents people from consuming these preferred foods nutritionally, these nutritionally preferred foods is, their own unawareness of their importance, and the fact that they're not interested or they lost interest, etc., which is part of the issue. But I think there are more structural barriers that are important and that are often overlooked. For example, if I look at price and cost of hunting and fishing for First Nations, this is a major barrier between people and their preferred food. I can also give the same example of cost for wild edible plants. It costs time to go collect these plants. It is more expensive to use local wheat varieties than it is to consume imported North American varieties, for example, in the context of the Middle East. So I think looking at structural barriers, systemic barriers is important. Cost is one of them. Availability with climate change, things are different now in terms of the environment and what people are used to in their environment. So these are additional barriers that prevent them from consuming more of those foods. I think what would work is to structurally look at what can be improved in terms of access. So having programs such as subsidies for First Nations to access their traditional food, having programs that promote the underutilized species, as an example, as in the example of Lebanon, what we did was to promote them as a money-making business. So people were using those foods as a way to cater for others in the city, and also consume the foods themselves, plus all the education efforts that were done sort of concomitantly with this. So I think that's my sort of main point, is that those systemic barriers and how we can identify them and work on them beyond individual education or just preference. However, preference is important. We know that there is generational transition. Younger people tend to eat less of traditional foods, pretty much across the spectrum. And so asking ourselves why and what is the role of those structural barriers in changing dietary habits. And that's all.
Thanks for sharing those experiences, Malek, and also for bringing up the really important issue that it's not just all individual choices and individual behaviors, but there are these really important structural issues that we could also look at. That is a very important point. I think we have about 3 minutes left before we'll go into a more open question and answer session. So if you would like to very briefly say what you think is the most urgent issue that we need to address in moving forward. I think we have come quite far in our understanding of how to, how to sway consumer attitudes and consumer behaviors. But what do you think in terms of research or program or policy, very briefly, is the most important thing to focus on? We'll start with Daniela, and then I'll pass to Lydia, and then Molly, and then Malek.
Yes, Gina. To wrap up, I think it will be the creation of networks, because we see in all this amount of sound evidence that we all contribute to different indicators, measuring, but I think we have to come a little bit closer into networks to have a more, let's say, participatory but systematic way to measure contributions. And this is done by research, and this is done by researchers, and this is done by us, by creating networks, coming together, sharing our results, and the methodologies have to be a little bit more standardized from my side.
Thanks, Daniela. Lydia? Lydia, would you like to say one, very briefly, one policy research or programmatic way forward?
I think I'll just sum up by saying we need to just rethink how to plan these programs and interventions, because we still have the question is, why are consumers not changing, regardless of what they know, regardless of what is available, etc. So much has been done in terms of interventions to try and address the issue of healthy diets. The question still remains, why are the consumers, or why are the diets not changing, or why the behaviors are not changing? So as researchers, as policymakers, as decision makers, we need to think, how do we plan better? Maybe what approaches would work better? What methods would work better? We need to rethink our guidelines that we have made. Are we factoring in the cultural aspect in the guidelines? Are we thinking about the local indigenous knowledge in the guidelines? What people already have? Are we thinking about the context, or are we just making blanket guidelines for everybody in that country? Because even in a country, we have different regions with different kinds of foods available. So we need to rethink the context of when we are giving guidelines, etc. We need to tailor them to the local conditions of the people, or to fit them to the local context, and then make the approaches that we're going to use easy, applicable for the people, something which will motivate them to continue. So we need to rethink how.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. Molly, a last quick reflection?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think as this conference is quite timely, following up on the UN Food Systems Summit and COP26, I think one of the urgent issues that's come out to me is how do we influence consumer behavior more towards foods or parts of food systems that is both sustainable and healthy, and not only considering environmental sustainability, but also considering the other two pillars of sustainability being economic and social sustainability, and making sure that interventions that are towards these sustainable healthy diets consider the three, and making sure that we move forward and transform our food systems to be more healthy and sustainable.
Excellent comment, Molly. Thanks for reminding us of the three pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Malek, closing thoughts?
Just a couple of last ideas. I think we need to understand competing forces better. We didn't talk in our panel about globalization, the nutrition transition, the role of industry, the push that ultra-processed foods is having in the food system, and how those changes are impacting what people consume. So we're looking at one side, and then I think we need to look at the other side, which is those competing forces. I would end here basically. It's like what is happening that is moving people away from the diets that are based in agrobiodiversity, and what can we do to understand these other forces.
Thank you so much, Malek. Conference organizers, if I get the program now, I will read some of the Q&A from the chat. Is that correct? I think so. So we have a question that says, I've heard you discussing a lot about consumers and how consumers are going to use these products, but I haven't heard anything about food industry or food processing. It hasn't even been mentioned. Do we have a panel member who would like to give us an example about their work with food industry or food processing? Daniela.
Well, we work here in the national level together with the food industry into analyzing consumers' behavior into how they were interpreting the labels. Because here in Ecuador we have the light system, so we have a red, a green, and a yellow for foods that have been processed, and even for foods that have been processed and have this label, when they have traditional ingredients, we contact the industry to see how we can find let's say a medium zone where we can educate the consumers into a healthier product when it was already in the label. It was pretty difficult because the national law had their own regulations for what has to be in the label, and what we did more in depth, and we had samples of 400 food items and their labels, was that the industry tricks a little bit into what is in the regulation and how to use that information to kind of make consumers choose that product, selling it as healthier when it was not, just because a traditional ingredient was there, but the way it was produced. So when we analyzed in depth how these fats and sugars were in the product, we couldn't find anymore because the national regulation was already done by that. And what the industry did allowed us was to educate people into the portions, into how much of that product they can consume. But as Malek said, it is a very difficult way of working with the industry, because what they want is to sell, and the consumers get all this marketing, which is heavier than nutrition education towards changing of behavior towards a healthy eating behavior. But we are there, and we knew that industry was open to discussion, but there is still the question. They want to make profit, we want healthier population. So that is a very good, difficult way to work when the policy and the regulations already favor the other side, so the industry.
Thanks, Daniela. Anybody else would like to give a reflection? I'll just read another question that is very similar. So the first question was, can we speak a little bit more about food industry and processing? And then another question is, does anybody have an example of preserving, processing traditional foods for use out of season? So can we take those foods that are very seasonally available and desired and tasty for consumer and lengthen their period of availability by using, food processing techniques? Does anybody have an example of that?
I think there are many. If I look, sorry, Molly, I jumped in. I'm thinking of traditional food with indigenous peoples here in Canada, and how traditional preserving methods are being rediscovered, smoking, drying, things that do not require a lot of electricity to keep over the winter, in addition to the more modern ways of freezing and canning. And I think these are interesting examples how culture, again, is guiding the rediscovery of these traditional methods. In the example from Lebanon about wild plants, these are often pickled or dried to be used later in the season. And so preservation is actually part of the traditional way of eating these foods. And seasonality is also about switching between different species and different foods, depending on their availability. And that's also part of the cultural way of dealing with the resources. And I saw a question about, habitat and things like that. And I think these are important issues to keep in mind when promoting these foods, is how sustainable we are, or we're promoting sustainability as we do this. And I think that's where sort of conservation and nutrition should be working hand in hand to make sure that we are not stampeding into these wild foods, for example, in the case of wild foods, or these animals in the case of traditional hunting.
If I could just add to what Malek said, I think this is a really good point about the traditional processing methods. And this was something when I was mentioning the work on working on fish powder is that we were looking at traditional processing methods such as sun drying and smoking of fish, and looking at kind of marrying traditional knowledge with modern technologies to improve food safety of these fish products, but also improve efficiency of processing, as sometimes sun drying can take a couple days, or pounding fish into fish powder with a mortar and pestle takes quite a lot of time. So like we tried to look at modern technologies that were available in communities to scale this up, which was quite a challenge in the rural communities in Malawi and Zambia that we were working in.
Yeah, where we were doing or where we are doing the work, we also tried to promote the sun drying of vegetables, where we tried to use the households, each household to make a simple sun dryer using locally available material, something which they could own. And from the experience that we gained, some households were able to do, especially where the men were involved and the men were willing to be part of the construction of this sun dryer. And then also how to preserve these sun-dried vegetables, because the aim is to use them to cover the gap during lean seasons. So during the demonstrations, we tried to even cook now recipes using these sun-dried vegetables. And interestingly, we found some respondents even preferring the taste of the sun-dried vegetables because of the approach used to prepare them. So this could be a way that can be used also to enhance the consumption of these foods which are in and out of season, using local and simple innovations which they can do, because they were saying, who will buy for me the materials for making this equipment? So first of all, you have to market it and make it look like you can do it. It's possible. What materials do you have? And then you only supplement with maybe one or two things which they need to buy. So they came to appreciate that it's possible, it's doable. Now the issue is, as I just said, sustaining the practice. But in terms of appreciating consumption of these locally preserved foods, some of the respondents really appreciated. And because you get them to taste both the fresh and the sun-dried, so you offer two. So try both. And interestingly, some would go for the sun-dried recipe. So it's an option that we can use. Yes.
Thank you so much. We'll begin the closing remarks now. And I think the lively discussion that we just had here at the end, that is getting us into solution spaces, really reinforces what Daniela was saying, is that we really want for the future networks to share more systematically, both from the research side, but also the programmatic and structural and policy side, which things really work. So I think just our little small fantastic panel was so lively and so knowledgeable, and it really does demonstrate how in this world now, COVID has shown us a lot, but that we can connect and have a nice network. So I really hope that we connect and form our network using this fantastic opportunity of the second Agrobiodiversity Congress to make a community of practice for ourselves. There were so many rich themes, it's very hard to summarize them all. I'll try my best. The abstract presenters really helped expand our minds and think about the importance of culture, the importance of resilience, the importance of nutrition security, the importance of seasonality. And then our panel members really even expanded upon that more and helped us think about the need for versatile products. I really liked the comment that is near and dear to anybody who works on agrobiodiversity, that it's not just about checking the box like I got a dark green leafy vegetable, but we have 50, 100, 200 species of dark green leafy vegetables. So it's also the variety of product. And I also appreciated the remark from a panel member that eating seasonally is eating culturally. So while we do want to be innovative and come up with ways to process and preserve food so that it's not lost or wasted, we can also be focusing on seasonality. And then that focus could kind of lead us basically into thinking about sustainability. I appreciated Molly really reminding us that there's the 3 pillars: economic, social, and environmental sustainability. I also heard our panel talking about the need to put indigenous foods into food-based dietary guidelines. And I know that many countries right now are in the process of developing their food-based dietary guidelines. And so it's quite important to put your local and traditional foods in there. And so I also really appreciated the remarks by Malek of it's not all just individual behaviors and the consumer, but we also need to work on policy issues. Daniela mentioned that as well, that there are some very significant structural barriers that we need to be thinking of to address. So we could go on, I could go on for hours. And if you're like me and would like to, we can form our own group and continue this really great discussion. But thank you so much to Daniela, Malek, Molly, and Lydia for inspiring us with this fantastic panel discussion and this great session. And thank you to the organizers, the Alliance of Biodiversity in SIAT, and the Italian government for organizing this fantastic event for us. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the Congress.